Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Today, we're going to discuss distributism. Our special guest is the respected and prolific author, Thomas Storck. Tom is also a member of the American Solidarity Party. Let's begin, as we always do and as we always need to do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful in the same Spirit. Help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Now, Mario Ramos Reyes, co-host extraordinaire, and I am going to be raising a number of questions for Tom Storck, and BTW, by the way, as they say. Tom really is prolific, and there's a whole website chock full of all his writings, properly annotated. But since we're talking about distributism, and since we're all of us philosophers of one sort or another, and since those who aren't familiar with distributism wonder what the dickens it is, our first question has got to be this, Tom. Just what is distributism?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is to use a definition that G.K. Chesterton's younger brother Cecil gave in 1917, and I'll read the definition, then I can make some comments on it. He wrote in an article in the magazine he edited, "A distributist is a man who desires that the means of production should, generally speaking, remain private property, but that their ownership should be so distributed that the determining mass of families, ideally every family, should have an efficient share therein. That is distributism, and nothing else is distributism. Distributism is quite as possible in an industrial or commercial as in an agrarian community," unquote. So the best way probably to explicate that definition is to contrast it with both capitalism and socialism, which you probably were planning to ask me about anyway. Now,
well, we were going to get to that, but we tend to jump around a lot. Go ahead.
Well, I'll do that now if you don't mind.
Sure.
Pius XI defined capitalism as the economic system in which ownership and work were divided, so that for example, in the ideal, if you will, although not in the sense of the essential or the essence of capitalism, you can see in a corporation where the owners, i.e. the shareholders, have absolutely nothing to do with the production of the whatever the company is producing. In fact, they might not even know exactly what the company does, but they own shares. They might own them through a mutual fund, say, and they're even one more step removed from the company. So there you have the separation of ownership and work. And this can be, obviously, there can be degrees of this, because you could have a capitalist enterprise where the owner works side by side with his employees, and that's a much more mitigated form. But in the extreme form of capitalism, the corporation, you have the owners who are totally separated from the actual work that the company is doing. Now, so distributism wants to reunite ownership and work, so that either you have small businesses in which the owner actually does the work, and perhaps he might hire some helpers who are actually trainees, hoping eventually for their own business, or for enterprises that by their nature require larger capital and larger workforce, worker ownership would be the ideal, so that you would have you still have worker ownership. You still have the ownership by the you wouldn't have separation of ownership and work, but you would have joint ownership by all the workers. And this might seem like people say, oh, that's pie in the sky, but it actually works quite a bit. There's actually a large hardware store and a Honda dealership right in the small town where we live that are worker-owned. And there are other larger companies in the U.S. and Europe that are worker-owned too. So distributism, to reiterate, is trying to reconnect ownership and work so that there's no separation or as little separation as possible between them.
That ownership, work, and family nexus is critical then.
May I jump in there?
Yes, please.
Yes, Thomas, I have a question. What about if a worker of someone is not interested in owning anything rather than receiving his salary? Let's say that you're a, let me finish. Let's say you're a teacher and you would like to teach in a public school, and then you receive from there a salary. So you don't qualify, according to the definition, to a distributist relationship because somebody else, the state, own or municipality own the school. And so you're receiving just the salary. How then that work?
Well, distributism, despite what Cecil Chesterton said, you're always going to have entities that are not organized on a distributist model. And let me talk about this in two ways. First of all, you might have, say, a plumber who just doesn't want to bother with all the questions of billing and keeping accounting and customers that don't pay. He's just quite content to work for somebody else as long as he gets a fair wage. There's nothing wrong with that. In the Middle Ages, which was the urban economy of the Middle Ages, was probably the best paradigm for distributism that we've seen yet. There were some, they had a three-stage process. You started out as an apprentice, then you became a journeyman where you could go around and do your own work, and then most people wanted to become owners eventually of their own small business. But some people were content to stop at journeyman. They weren't interested in all the hassles that would go with owning a small business, so they were content to be wage earners. There's nothing wrong with that. But under capitalism, the assumption is that you're going to be a wage earner and you're not going to have control over your work. So that for and the problem with the real problem with capitalism, well, there are two problems with it. One of them is that for a capitalist who's separated from the work, workers are always an item of expense. He wants to lower his labor costs as much as possible. Certain of his costs he can't really lower very much. Utilities, interest that he owns to the bank for loans, supplies that he buys. Unless you're a huge behemoth like Walmart, you don't have much control over those kinds of costs. But you do have control over labor costs. And that's why under capitalism you have a perpetual downward pressure on wages. And so that's one of the bad things about capitalism is you have this labor market divide, and the people who call the shots it's in their economic interest to lower wages as much as possible, or to move their factories somewhere else so they can have lower wages, or to lay off workers. And now, in the instance you raised, like a school, well, actually, you could have, the medieval universities were kind of organized on a distributist model in the sense that the faculties controlled the important decisions. This could be revived again. I'm not suggesting that it could be done everywhere, and where you have the state owning a particular institution, you couldn't do it very well. But as I say, it's a matter of preponderance. It's a matter of is the economy primarily one in which work and ownership are separated, or one in which primarily work and ownership are joined? And that's the question. It's not going to be 100%. It's not even 100% nowadays, even though we have a capitalist economy. There are plenty of worker-owned businesses. There are plenty of small businesses. But they're not going – it's a question of what predominates.
So it seems that the goal then is to distribute, if you will, both economic and political power, because in the capitalist model, the owners of the medium of production are the ones who are going to keep power and move around things, whereas the workers are going to be dependent on their salary. Am I right in my assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it does have a political side. I mean, it's primarily an economic question, but you're right. We see now in the United States, especially, the tremendous power of corporations because they have money, and they have more money than anybody else, and they're pretty well organized, and they can get their points of view across, and they can get their sympathetic lawmakers to go their way. So one of the byproducts of a distributist economy would be, yes, that you would have more widespread political power. It wouldn't be concentrated in the hands of corporations, but it would be the first line of work, as it were, would be the economic aspect. The political would be something that would follow from that, and would be kind of a byproduct from that.
So how is it, final question to this, why is the reason why some economies call political economy? Is because there is a primacy of politics over economics, or the relationship must be equal between the two areas?
Well, the economy, the economic historian Karl Polanyi talked about how traditional economies were embedded in society, but now we tend to think of almost the opposite, that society is embedded in the economy. And you can see that in a country like the United States, which probably has the most pure capitalist economy anywhere, where you have everything is estimated in terms of its economic value. For example, people justify higher education not by, gee, I'll become more wise, I'll become acquainted with the whole historical tradition of the West. No, how much more money can you make? That's the justification for higher education in the U.S. That's almost the only one that's ever given. And that shows that the economy has taken over society. So the idea of political economy, which was an older term, still sometimes used, is that the economy is part of the polis, part of the political entity, which is the natural, according to Aristotle, it's natural for man to live in community. So you have the family, you have the village, then you have the full community, the polis, as Aristotle says, which is just as natural as the family. So obviously, in a polis, you have to have a certain amount of economic activity, but it's got to be subordinate to the overall goals of society and to human welfare. Society doesn't serve the market. The market ought to serve society. And so political economy was a way of expressing that relationship.
If I can, I'd like to stir the pot here a little bit. I haven't seen much attention called to it, but perhaps the greatest contemporary Catholic social thinker, a philosopher, and a convert to Catholicism is Alistair McIntyre. And his most recent book is titled Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. And then there's a subtitle, there usually is nowadays, An Essay on Desire, Practical Reasoning, and Narrative. Now, what interests me in this book especially, it's all interesting, is that for the first time, and as I say, I haven't seen much discussion of this at all, McIntyre, distributism, well, for McIntyre is a leading light. And he discusses distributism, not at great length because it's a wide-ranging book, but I'd like to pluck out just a paragraph in which Alistair McIntyre, notes a distributist criticism of capitalism that connects with desires. So here's McIntyre. He says, from a distributist point of view, what is amiss with capitalism is not only what it does to the unemployed and the poor, but also what it does to rich and to better paid workers and managers. Human beings can achieve their common and their individual goods only through concerted actions that require cooperative relationships informed by the norms of the natural law. And in order to achieve those goods, they must develop their powers as rational agents. Okay, so to achieve our goods, we have to work together, and to work together well, we have to develop our powers as rational agents. Now he continues, however, the social order of capitalism not only recurrently imposes types of social relationship that violate these norms, it also miseducates and wrongly directs desires, something that Marxist critics of capitalism have also recognized. Marginal note, McIntyre was a Marxist before he became a Catholic, something that Marxist critics of capitalism have also recognized, so that for many of every social class, the satisfaction of their desires and the development of their powers becomes incompatible. What they want is too often what they have no good reason to want. Those of every class who succeed in getting what they want under capitalism are likely, therefore, just because they so often do not want what they need, to lead impoverished lives. What do you make of that, Tom?
Yeah, you might remember that a few minutes before I said there were two major problems with capitalism, and one of them was the tendency to lower wages, and I talked about that. But I didn't talk about the second major problem with capitalism. And the second major problem with capitalism flows from the essential nature of capitalism also, in the sense that as soon as let me step back a minute. If you ask anybody, why do we have an economy? Why does mankind need external goods? Why do we have the capacity to produce external goods? Almost everybody would say, well, it's because we have to supply our needs that way. But when you separate the economy, you separate work from ownership, the owner is no longer particularly interested in making a good product to supply a human need. He's interested in making money. He's interested in selling his product, no matter what it might be, whether it's useful, whether it's harmful, whether it's shoddy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, greed and sin exist in the human race and have since the fall, so you're not going to have a perfection under distributist owner. But by and large, you would have more a distributist, small businessman, small plumber, or a carpenter, whatever, is going to care about his product more. He's going to see himself not just as a businessman, he's going to see himself as a craftsman. And so he's going to realize, why am I doing this? I'm doing this to supply a need for my fellow human beings. And whereas the capitalist owner, the tendency is, I want to sell this. And again, you can see it in the corporation, where the stockholders don't give a damn about what the company is producing, as long as it's something that their stock prices rise or their dividend checks keep coming. They don't ask themselves, gee, is this company doing a good job? I mean, I'm not saying there's no one who does that, but it would be much more rare. And they certainly don't have that pride in workmanship that the small craftsmen have. So yeah, it colors our whole approach to economics. The economy is now seen as a means of getting rich. So people who get really, really rich are seen as people to be looked up to, instead of looked upon as pitiful fools who have wasted their life doing something which is really peripheral, and it's going to possibly be to their disadvantage when they go before the judgment. So yeah, I agree with McIntyre. I wouldn't put it exactly the same way he does, but essentially I would say the same thing. It's the capitalism has fueled the notion that the economy exists to enrich one rather than the economy exists to serve our needs.
Now, shifting a bit here, as an old teacher of mine used to say, by way of easy and natural transition, our gentle listeners might think, these folks sure don't like capitalism. I wonder, are they really socialists underneath it all? What's the relationship, Tom, and what's the difference between distributism and socialism?
Okay, this is a very complex question, and so I'd ask any listeners to please pay attention because it's not a simple matter. Socialism developed with two aspects in the 19th century. There was the economic aspect, and then there was this, actually more important, there was a kind of a philosophical aspect that saw itself as hostile to the traditional Christian civilization that was dying out at that time, but had still important elements in existence. And socialists, in their reaction against capitalism, somewhat misplaced, identified capitalism with this traditional Christian civilization, which it was not. But they were hostile to traditional Christian civilization, and they were hostile to the capitalist economic order. Well, Orthodox socialism in the late 19th century had a monolithic economic model, and that's why if you read Leo XIII, he talks about socialist desire to take away all private property, or at least all productive private property, and that's what he focuses on because that was a major feature of socialism at the time. However, if you go forward 40 years to the next major socialist cycle, Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno, you find probably the most nuanced discussion of socialism that I've ever seen anywhere. Pius XI really deserves incredible credit for this. He points out several things. He points out that between Leo XIII's time and 1931, the socialism had split. There were the communists who still wanted to have no or very little private property, but there were what he called the moderate socialists. And the moderate socialists were not a monolith. They had different views. But he explicitly says that in many respects, and doesn't say everything, but in many respects, the moderate socialists, their program of economic reform is very similar to the views of Catholic social reformers. He says, and I'm quoting here, "It cannot be denied that socialist programs often strikingly approach the just demands of Christian social reformers." I'm going to read it again. "It cannot be denied that its programs often strikingly approach the just demands of Christian social reformers." That's in Quadragesimo Anno, section 113. So you have, by 1931, and you have some socialists whose economic proposals were very close to the encyclical program that the popes were putting out for social reform. So does that mean a Catholic can be a socialist? That's an obvious question, and Pius XI takes it up right after that, and he says no. But why? Not because of the economic proposals of the socialists, but because true socialism carries with it that anti-Christian animus, that hostility to Christian civilization that I mentioned a minute ago, that has characterized true socialism since its origins in the early 19th century. I can give you an example. I have it here. I'm holding it in my hand. A pamphlet called "What is Socialism?" put out by the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, now called the Democratic Socialists of America. And many of the economic proposals they advocate in this pamphlet are ones a distributist or any Catholic ought to be able to say, yes, worker ownership, and so on. But listen to this. "The struggle to set humans free lies behind all social ferment of modern times. Its first round was moral, the growing recognition which signaled the end of the Dark Ages, that humans need not be slaves of old prejudices, beliefs, and customs, but can make their own decisions and chart their own lives," unquote. Obviously, what is it talking about? is talking about it's exhibiting an hostility to the Catholic civilization of the Middle Ages. So that's what I mean by socialism carries this unfortunate legacy of economic materialism with it, and hostility to Christian civilization. And that's the reason why socialism and Catholicism are incompatible. As far as socialist economic proposals, they have to be evaluated one by one. If somebody says, I'm a socialist and I want to promote worker ownership, I'll say, okay, that sounds good. Let's see how you want to do it. And it might be something that I could fully support. And by the way, not everybody who calls himself a socialist is really a socialist. For example, the British Labour Party calls itself socialist, or at least used to. And but in the 1920s, the English bishops officially decreed that the socialism that the Labour Party in England represented was not the kind that was condemned by the Church. And in fact, British Catholics generally voted Labour. That was their kind of, just like in American Catholics generally voted for the Democrats. It was a traditional party because they were mostly working class. So socialism is a very complex phenomenon, and you have to make a distinction between the economic proposals of socialists and the philosophical proposals. In fact, in Gentissimus Annus, John Paul says the root error of socialism is anthropological. Its conception of man is flawed because it's essentially materialist. But that doesn't mean that they haven't come up with good economic proposals, and that you can't work with socialists sometimes to implement those proposals.
Lots of good distinctions there. Mario, maybe you would like to ask Tom some questions here that would connect us with South American realities.
Right. Yes, I was following attentively your very, very interesting distinction and explanation about this type of socialism. And immediately came to my mind the 1930s in Latin America, where yes, there was a tradition of socialism, which we may call, or we used to call, social democrat, which generally came after the Great Depression impact in Latin America, and they came mainly from certain ideas of the Second International. They were not the orthodox Marxists, rather than they were reformers. Now, in the context of some countries, Chile, for instance, in Latin America, they were called, quote-unquote, cousin of the...
Called what? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that word.
They were called relative or cousins, COUSIN, of Catholics. Why? Because even though they may establish certain policies close to what we maybe you mentioned about Catholic social teaching, about the ownership of the means of production, etc., they still have this worldview which was quite materialistic. In other words, it was very hard for those social democrat parties, socialist parties, to separate or distinguish what was the worldview, the anthropological view of the family, and the policy regarding even abortion, divorce, and the economic policies. Now, because of that, in the 1930s began a movement within the Catholic tradition, which later on transformed itself, the movement, into political party, and those political parties were the Christian Democrats. So, in some countries in Latin America in the 1930s, there was two traditions which were quite similar in some ways. One was Christian Democrats, and the other were the Social Democrats. And generally, they were competing in some ways, election in some democratic countries, but they were very similar until the 1960s, when the old Orthodox Marxist tradition, through guerrilla fighting, began challenging the reformers. So, just this is more a comment than a question. So, my question is, why is it that these socialist party, these social democrat parties, which began to be formed in Europe and in Latin America, were not formed or began to be a protagonist in American history in 1940s?
I'm sorry, why they weren't formed?
Right. In other
words,
States? United States, yes.
Well, the New Deal in the United States borrowed elements from European social movements, elements which surfaced in socialists, fascists, and Christian Democrats, because some of the same techniques that were advocated they made perfect sense, and so different groups would appropriate them with different twists, as it were, different colorings, different flavors, so that, for example, if you read Quartesimo Anno, you'll remember the criticism that Pius XI gives of Mussolini's fascist economy, and he points out that the vocational groups, he doesn't use that name, and that Mussolini wanted to set up were basically agents of the state. They weren't independent. Whereas in what Pius XI was advocating was guilds, like in the medieval guilds, where you had the all who worked in the same industry working together to support the common good. They were more or less independent of the state, but Mussolini wanted to take those guilds and transform them into government departments, as it were, or practically government departments. So you had in the United States, you had the Democratic Party did adopt some of these things. It wasn't the Christian Democratic Party. I mean, in the United States, with the religious landscape being the way it is, it's very hard to have a specifically Christian party, and it would be hard to get cooperation. But I guess, in a sense, in the late 30s and early 40s, you had as close to that as you ever got in the United States, where you had people like Monsignor John A. Ryan, for example, the greatest American Catholic theologian on social matters, was actually appointed to one of the New Deal, had a minor office in the New Deal Economic Administration, the National Recovery Administration. Sorry, I hope I addressed your question.
Yes.
Tom, in addressing Mario's question, especially in your last comments, you call attention to state control and forms of socialism that, the state orders. And then thinking historically, if you think about socialism, you have the kind of socialisms that have come to be referred to as utopian socialists. And then you have the development of Marxist thought, which would rule out a utopian socialism. And then, of course, the distinction between the early Marx, who was, in many respects, a humanist, and the later Marx, who was only dubiously a humanist. And that takes me to something that McIntyre says, not now in contrasting distributism with capitalism, but in contrasting distributism with Marxism. And if you will bear with me, and gentle auditors, if you will bear with me as well, I'd like to read a paragraph. We had a paragraph, McIntyre contrasting distributism with capitalism, especially with respect to the generation of desires. And now a paragraph from McIntyre contrasting distributism with Marxism, especially with regard to the catalyst for social and political change and the role of the state. So here's McIntyre. It was a central thesis of the Thomist criticisms of Marxism that the gross inequalities in respect of economic and political power, and we still have those today, that the gross inequalities in respect of economic and political power demanded by the dominant Marxist conceptions of the transition to socialism would represent as much of a danger as the gross inequalities of the capitalist order, a thesis that became more and more persuasive as the 20th century proceeded. There were indeed some Marxists who also recognized this danger and attempted to address it from within their Marxist perspective, but they were unable to provide a convincing account of how, from their starting points, they could arrive at what was, on the distributist view that some Thomists had developed, most needed. So what's most needed? A series of genuinely local political initiatives through which the possibilities of a grassroots distribution and sharing of power and property could be achieved. Moreover, there was a fundamental difference between Marxists and distributists about the agents of social transformation. Marxists took it that in the end everything depended on the emergence of a revolutionary working class. Distributists held that because there is a human interest and not just a class interest in remaking the social and economic order, needed changes can come from several quarters. So we have a decentralization of agents and institutions of social change. What do you make of that, Tom?
Yeah, if you understand capitalism the way Pius XI does, what does a person do who has a successful business? The first thing he thinks about doing is expanding it. And so if you have a restaurant and you're making money and you're supporting your family, the first thing that's going to occur to most capitalists is, gee, why don't I open another restaurant?
Grow the business.
Pardon?
Grow the business.
Grow the business, exactly. But if you have an understanding of work and economics and as supplying a need, you might think, well, no, I'm supporting my family quite decently right now. If there's a need for more restaurants, well, somebody else can do it. And it shouldn't be me. But now, obviously, a small chain of local restaurants is not going to do too much damage. But when you put that in a national or international scheme with corporations, that's what they're doing. They're going beyond the local. That's one of the reasons our economy is no longer a series of local economies, but it's a worldwide economy because the corporations demand a worldwide economy, and they have the technology now to achieve it. But if an economy were focused on supplying human needs, then it would tend, I emphasize the word tend, it would tend to be a locally focused economy because you wouldn't have the desire to maximize your income. You'd have a desire to, more or less, to serve local human needs, and that we're all human needs are always local, which brings up something that I probably should have mentioned before, and I'll mention it now if I may, which is that if you simply had a distributist economy in which you had competing small businesses, free competition, as Pius XI says, always leads to economic dictatorship. So what you want to do is you want to curb competition, which is what the medievals did by the guilds. And the guild has a place in distributism, and Belloc talked about it, and it's been a kind of a feature of Catholic thought. The great German economist, Father Heinrich Pesch, S.J., who died in 1926, and who set forth a system called solidarism, which is really, in my opinion, overlaps very well with distributism. There's different emphasis there, but the same basics. That was one of the key points of his system, namely that you have to have workers organized into guilds, which would be self-governing, but which would moderate or eliminate competition, so that different restaurants, instead of seeing themselves as competitors, hoping to put the other guy out of business, would see themselves as brothers serving a human need, which is really the sensible way to look at an economy.
All right. Mario,
Mm-hmm.
what do you have to say on this?
Let me give you an example that I have experienced just recently. I just visited Latin America, and there was a crisis there because for the first time, Uber began implementing its system there, which make the taxi unions and groups, association very angry. And the reason why that happened is because the market for transportation was open. So the competition was out there in public square, so to speak, in the market. And so the prices were down. People were happy with Uber because on the one hand was providing job for many millennials who were completely without hope, and now they have at least something to do, make some money, and then at the same time they could pay their bills and go to college, etc. So prices were down, Uber provided jobs, and also transportation improved immensely because the car that Uber required for driver to drive, it should be newer and so on. So there was a huge fight with the taxi union, and then what discovered the taxi were more expensive, older cars, and generally because they were somehow working with the state, we control all the taxi system, control the prices, and so on. Politically was controlled. So the argument of many people was making was, well, then you see now the free market, I'm going to use this term provocatively, free market work better than a system which is driven by the state, and the state somehow, when intervening in the market, make things worse, as is happened here. What do you say about that?
Well, very often, when you look at a system like that and you say, oh, this proves the free market works better, you have to ask yourself, you have to say to yourself, the devil can be in the details. Was the system that was in existence prior, was it well designed? Was it simply an instance of people who had political connections taking advantage of those connections and providing bad service at a high price? And I can't answer that question, obviously, because I don't know anything about the taxi situation in Latin America. But I can speak to the general principle. The general principle is that in any economic process, everybody who's involved has to be adequately compensated. It doesn't make any sense. No capitalist, for example, would tell a supplier, well, maybe Walmart would try, but no capitalist, no ordinary capitalist would tell a supplier, look, I'm not going to pay you what it costs you to provide me with that soap or whatever you're providing me, because I don't want to, because I want to make more of a profit margin on that. And the supplier would say, well, okay, fine, I'm not going to sell you anything anymore. But they would realize that the supplier has to make a certain amount of money. The only economic group that people seem to forget this about are workers. They seem to think workers can live on nothing. So the question is, were the taxi drivers adequately compensated? prior to the onset of Uber, and I don't know about that. But one thing, when in a capitalist, these taxi unions were existing in a capitalist economy, in an economy that tended to look on economic activity as in terms of enrichment. So one of the things that the medieval guilds they operated in an environment in which the economy was seen as a way of supplying human needs. So the guilds weren't just interested in maximizing their returns; they were interested in providing quality products at a fair price. But they were also interested in making sure that the guild members were adequately compensated. Now, they had human nature, since the fall being what it is, they had a constant struggle. I admit that they had a constant struggle to get their guild members not to cheat and to treat their apprentices fairly, and so on and so on. That's inseparable from the human condition, unfortunately. But if we had a distributed society and a distributist economy, then there would be more of a tendency for people not to say, "Gee, I've got a neat situation here. I have we have a monopoly over taxis. We're going to jack up our prices as much as we can, and who cares about service? Who cares about whether we get there on time and that kind of stuff?" And a medieval guild would have excoriated those people. They would say, "You're not doing your job. Your job is to provide a quality product at a good price, at a fair price." So that's the general way I can answer your question. I don't know whether or not the prices that Uber charges are more fair than the prices that the taxis charge, but I can say that as a general principle, we can't just say the lower the price, the better, because if the price just goes down and down and down, then somebody is not being adequately compensated for in the economic process. Remember that in the Middle Ages, the just price you could offend against the just price both by paying too much and by paying too little. So nowadays we tend to say, "Oh, gee, I got a real bargain. I paid almost nothing for that." Well, maybe you didn't pay an adequate return for everybody who was involved in the supply chain. That's why if you go to Walmart and you say, "Gee, I got a good deal here," yeah, you got a good deal here, but at whose expense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have to look at the details and find many devils, no doubt. I can't help but asking myself, I wonder if Elizabeth Warren has a detailed plan for Uber. But that's an aside. And this always happens, Tom, and Mario and I are so familiar with this. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to be sure, and that's why I'm going to do it right now, to interject a question that one of the Solidarity Party members raised after I posted what the agenda was for today's discussion. And the party member asks, what's the connection then between distributism and Georgeism, as in Henry George,
yes.
As in Henry George and land value?
Well, Henry George, and I am not an expert on Henry George, but I do know something about his theories. He saw one thing as the key to creating a just economy, i.e. the single tax on land. And he saw land value as being created or certainly enhanced purely by community activity, like you build a road and then your land goes up in value because previously to that nobody could get to your land. But now, and the community paid for the road, and now you're profiting by the increased value, and you don't have any right to that profit. Well, Georgism can be seen in a hard and a soft version. So, for example, John A. Ryan, whom I mentioned earlier, in his really phenomenal book, Distributive Justice, rejects what he calls, what he doesn't call, rather, but I would call hard Georgism, i.e. the notion that really you have no right to that profit. the only fair tax is land tax and so on. But he does accept as quite useful what one might call soft Georgism, i.e., incorporating certain features that Henry George enunciated in his book Progress and Poverty, which can be useful. And I won't go into that now for a number of reasons. But I would say Georgism is really working on a different tack from distributism, because George said he didn't care how much land you had as long as he could have his single tax on land in place. Well, distributists would sort of say, well, no, I don't think so. Regardless of how you tax the land, whoever is going to control huge amounts of land is going to have more economic power than others. Now, also distributism is one thing about Catholic social teaching, and you get people who, social reformers who have one plan. All we need to do is we need to create money a different way. All we need to do is we need to have a single tax, and then everything else will follow. Well,
Bitcoin,
if you read the encyclicals, that's
Bitcoin.
not the way the popes have approached. Pardon?
Bitcoin.
Yeah. But if you read the encyclicals, that's not what the popes say. There are a number of things that need to be done. We need to have just wages. We need to have occupational groups. We need to have well-distributed property. So I would say Georgism, to the extent that it has something good to say, could be a subsidiary factor in a just economy, but it wouldn't be the only thing, and it would be, and it's not really the same as distributism. Now, left libertarianism, as everybody knows, in the United States at least, most politically aware people are divided into two large blocks, conservatives and liberals. Now, these blocks are as much cultural as they are political. People tend to have their own style of clothing, the kind of cars they drive, where they live, even what they eat, even what foods they eat, what kind of restaurants they would go to, and there's a tendency. I'm not saying it's absolute, obviously, and the political views of these two blocks are just a hodgepodge of accidental things that have come together that have really very little coherence philosophically. Now, left libertarianism, as I understand the term, would be libertarians who would have this left cultural predilection. So, for example, they might be very much in favor of marijuana, legalizing prostitution, what have you. Whereas traditionally, the more right libertarians, I think, would have maybe. They would have said, "Oh, okay, yeah, I guess so," but they wouldn't have been wild about those ideas because they would have culturally they would have been more on the right, and they would be coming out of, say, what we call conservatism. So that's how I understand left libertarianism, and it has absolutely nothing to do with distributism. I mean, distributism is not libertarianism. Distributism is not anti-state. Obviously, distributism wants a state that does its job but doesn't do somebody else's job. That's why we want self-governing guilds, not government departments. But we're not hostile to the state. We're not. The Catholic tradition, including the pre-Catholic, if you will, like in Aristotle, tradition is very clear about the role of the political community in Aristotle and St. Thomas. In Leo XIII's encyclicals about the state, he's very clear. The state is a natural thing. It needs to have authority, and it has a role to play. Not every role to play. It doesn't usurp other people's roles, but it's the idea that the state should be reduced as small possible thing. That government is best which governs least. That's nonsense. That government is best that does its job, and that job should. And if you make that job either too much or too little, then you've distorted the role of government.
And yet, as Dorothy Day was quick to point out, we should not think of the state as holy mother of the state.
Yeah, well, I think Dorothy Day was somewhat inconsistent. I mean, I admire her very much, but I think she was somewhat inconsistent in her thinking. She called herself at times an anarchist, if I'm not mistaken. But she wasn't really an anarchist, and she saw the need for the state. The state has assumed roles in the 20th century and 21st century that especially say in the military, that it has no right to do. On the other hand, in the United States, there's this very anti-state attitude, which has given room to corporations to dominate things. So I keep returning to the same thing. The state has a very important role to play, but it's not the only. It's not on the continent. It's not the only entity that has a role to play.
All right, now let me ask you this. How can the American Solidarity Party, the party to which the three of us belong, how can the American Solidarity Party advance distributist principles? How can we do that?
At this point, about the only thing we can do is that we can advocate for them and publicize them. We can educate ourselves in the first place, and then we can advocate for them measures that would tend to advance distributism. For example, you could have tax breaks given when larger entities are broken up or when they're turned over to their workers. There was a very interesting book published, probably about 15, 20, more like 20 years ago, called Curing World Poverty, that pointed out that companies, one of the problems with, if you have a lot of money or if you have a lot of connections and you're a rich capitalist, it's easy to get financing to set up your company. And therefore, you are the one who calls the shots. If you're a group of workers who come together and say, gee, I think we could form a good company, you usually have very little source of financing or any, and no bank's going to really support you. How can they get it? How can they do that? Well, the ideas in the book were that they could get loans based on future profits, and a government guaranteed loan, which would give them a lower rate. So there are all kinds of practical things. I'm generally more of a theoretician than somebody who comes up with practical proposals, but there are a lot of practical proposals that the ASP could advocate for and that people could flesh out. And
part of our advocacy could be showing the way in terms of some clear thinking about muddy political categories, left, right, conservative, liberal, and the like.
Yeah, I mean, those categories are ridiculous. It's true that we have these two blocks that call themselves conservative and liberal, but those names are ridiculous. They might as well call themselves peaches and carrots. They have no...
Well, how about peaches and cream, then?
Yeah, they have no coherence. So you'll find people who say, is that idea conservative or liberal? And then they'll decide which it is, and they'll say, oh, I don't like it or I do like it. Why don't they ask themselves the question, is that idea good or bad? That makes a lot of sense. And each of these blocks holds, as I said, a hodgepodge of things that have no philosophical coherence. So you'll have people who are very concerned about the effect of the economy on the poor, but if someone says, well, gee, abortion kills the poor, oh, that's another thing. That's another matter. That's different. Or you'll have people you'll have conservatives who are very aware of the fact that sexual license, sexual promiscuity has bad social effects. But if you point out to them that so does the economic, wild economics, the kind of capitalism we have does the same thing, that's different. That's different. That's another thing altogether.
Here I think of Elizabeth Anscombe's phrase, the endless twistiness of the human mind.
Yeah, it's actually astounding. But the devil loves to introduce two groups which are at war with each other, and each of which has some recognition, some glimmer at least, of the truth, but they refuse to acknowledge that the other side is anything good, and so they fight each other.
All right, now here's maybe the toughest question of all. If you could recommend one book for a would-be distributist to read, what would that one book be?
Why only one?
I'm hoping it'll be a slender volume, Tom. I'm hoping it'll be a slender volume.
Well, I don't know. I think it's not. I don't understand why you only want one book, but I would recommend Belloc's The Restoration of Property, which is a slender book too.
Very good. Very interesting.
It's not everything, but it's if I had to recommend just one book, I would recommend that. Hilaire Belloc, The Restoration of Property. It's a very fine introduction to distributism.
All right.
But there's a lot of distributist writing, and distributism has been revived since the late 90s, and a lot of that, there's a lot of very fine writing going on, some of it on the Distributist Review or the Practical Distributist websites.
Okay, excellent.
Pardon?
Excellent. And let me remind everybody also once again that probably the most influential Catholic social thinker today is Alistair McIntyre, and he certainly has a distributist turn in his most recent book. Well, once again, we're at the end of the hour, and as always, or almost always, we close with the gospel of the day. This is from Matthew chapter 25. Jesus told his disciples this parable. The kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones, when taking their lamps, brought no oil with them, but the wise brought flasks of oil with their lamps. Since the bridegroom was long delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight there was a cry, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all of those virgins got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise ones replied, "No, for there may not be enough for us and you. Go instead to the merchants and buy some for yourselves." While they went off to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went into the wedding feast with him. Then the door was locked. Afterwards the other virgins came and said, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he said in reply, "Amen, I say to you, I do not know you. Therefore, stay awake, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The Gospel of the Lord.
Amen.
Thanks very much, Tom, and as always, thank you, Mario. You help us every time connect with the other half of the Western world.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week, and God bless, Godspeed.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.